on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into today's Zoom session, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to today's event, which is very much not de minimis when it comes to this topic. Before we get to today's event, a couple of things to update you on. On Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, we are hosting Ambassador Catherine Tai, the United States Trade Representative, for her first sit-down discussion with WITA since becoming USTR. The event will be in person at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C., and will be simulcast on Zoom. She'll be sitting down with Wendy Cutler, one of the original authors of the TPP, to talk about the U.S.'s new initiative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as well as her upcoming trips to the Summit of the Americas and the 12th WTO Ministerial. And next week, WITA will be co-hosting an event at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. So if you're going to be in DC on Monday or Los Angeles on Wednesday, please sign up to attend these in-person events. Links are in the chat. As you know, if you've attended any of our webinars these past 2 years, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them here today. Welcome today to Eric O'Toole of Barlow & Company. Eric's the former president of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. Jeff Tews with Columbia Sportswear Company, Meredith Goldman with Oracle America, Melissa Nelson with Sanmar, and Ambassador Susan Schwab, Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland. Welcome, Eric, Jeff, Meredith, Melissa, and Susan, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this live on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can toward the latter part of today's session. You should have also received a copy of today's event program by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions of today's guests. We'll bring a variety of different perspectives to a discussion that is anything but minor or trivial, to use the dictionary definition of de minimis. In fact, I've had more discussions about the makeup of today's panel than any event in my 7 years as executive director of WITA. So thanks to all of you who helped put together this extra large panel. Except for our moderator, all but one of our discussants today are new to the WITA stage, and we're grateful to all of them for joining us. Beth Henke with American Eagle Outfitters, Victoria Lane with Coppersmith Global Logistics, Marian Rowden with the eMerchants Trade Council, and Ben Wassler with the National Foreign Trade Council. We're also pleased to welcome back Brenda Smith with Expeditors. She was last with us in 2021 when she was with Customs and Border Protection. Welcome back, Brenda. And of course, a special welcome to my dear friend Scott Miller, our moderator for today's event. Scott has ascended to the lofty role of non-resident senior mentor for executive education at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an appropriate perch for someone who has mentored many of us in the trade community over the years. Thank you, Scott, for joining us today and mentoring us about this complicated topic. And welcome to our whole panel.
Well, Ken, thank you for the wonderful, warm introduction. Delighted to be with you today. What my new role really means is I've moved south, pulled my pants up to my armpits, and complain about the government full time. So that's my day job, but I get a chance to take a little break from it with events like this. So it's great to be with you. We have a really rollicking discussion ahead, mostly because of the variety of points of view on the issue, both on the substance of the issue itself and the process by which policy is being made here. So I'm going to devote maximum time to the panelists. In sequence, we will hear from Marianne Rowden, CEO of the eMerchants Trade Council. She'll be followed by Victoria Lane, who's with Coppersmith. I'm going to make sure I get this right. Coppersmith Global Logistics. She's the VP of Corporate Compliance. And her organization is in the customs brokerage and freight forwarding business. She's also represented the industry in that in several capacities. Third, we'll hear from Brenda Smith, who previously was an executive or an officer with the Customs and Border Protection. So you have very recent CBP experience to bring to bear. Then we'll hear from Beth Henke, Senior VP, Deputy General Counsel of American Eagle Outfitters, AEO Incorporated. Finally, Ben Waster, Senior Director of the National Foreign Trade Council, will talk about what's going on the congressional side of things. So with that as the brief introduction, Marianne, over to you.
Thanks, Scott, for moderating, and thanks to WITA for putting together this panel. Obviously, de minimis has become a very hot topic in the trade community. But one of the things that I wanted to start out talking about is nomenclature is important. And for those of us who are trade nerds, we often think of nomenclature referencing the harmonized tariff schedule. And that's certainly true, but how you name things and talk about things matters. And what has happened over the last couple of years, certainly as we're seeing legislation relating to de minimis, is people talk about de minimis, and I've had inquiries from financial services firms about it, talking about de minimis as a trade program. It is not a trade program. 19 U.S.C. Section 1321 is administrative exemption, and it is to conserve government resources processing entries of low value shipments. Well, theoretically, they're not entries, they are imports. And it's done really to balance, what the government spends time on. And we've had this for, I think, almost 100 years with the Tariff Act of 1930, where the exemption started at, the threshold was $1. And the government just came to the conclusion that it costs more to process that shipment from under a formal entry than the cost of any duties derived from that entry. So it's been, the de minimis level has been raised over the years, primarily to keep up with the cost of inflation. So it went from $1 to $5, and then I think to 20, but the big jump obviously was $200 in 1993 as part of the MOD Act. And then obviously in 2016, up to $800 under TIFTIA. And of course, the other big point to make is that it is Congress that sets the de minimis level. And this is a policy that should not change frequently. And the increase in de minimis, although I don't remember at the time if this was an explicit argument, but one of the benefits to the level what we have now, just in general, is for those of you who travel overseas, as many of us used to do, we always got that blue card or had global entry, and we had an $800 personal exemption to bring things from overseas. And, the recent raising of the level to $800 shipping goods from overseas into the United States brings that in parity on a par with what you can do as a traveler. So I think that historical context is important to keep in mind, and I will turn it over back to Scott.
Thank you, Brenda. Or Marianne, I'm sorry. Thank you. And Victoria, tell us how the world looks from freight forwarders and customs brokers, if you would, please.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you for allowing me to be on this panel today with my esteemed colleagues that I'm seeing here on the screen. As a customs broker and freight forwarder, we see Section 321 as, and I'm going to disagree with Marianne here just a bit, that it is an entry per se for admissibility of that merchandise. And as she said, the personal exemption that we're allowed when we travel overseas, that's that personal exemption. What we're starting to see are more and more marketplaces, platforms. I mean, we've all seen it on Facebook and Instagram, etc., where you can purchase something and you don't really know where it's coming from, who's selling it, how was it made, is there forced labor, is there anti-dumping, is there another government agency that might be involved, for instance, CPSC or FDA or USDA or any of those other government agencies. You just don't know as a common consumer. So as a customs broker, what we're seeing is the move away from knowing who the buyer and seller is to more who the shipper and the consignee are. And a lot of times those two parties don't really have a vested financial interest in that $800 or less item. So it could be, that the item necessarily doesn't qualify for admissibility purposes. Another thing is, who has the right to make that entry? Who has the authority to do that? Right now it's the owner or purchaser, but now, we're hearing that consignee wants to be added to statutory language and so on and so forth. So we're more concerned about who has the right to make entry and are those goods violative or not? And that's what we see in the industry. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Brenda, you were at CBP when the change from 200 to 800 occurred, or shortly thereafter, and had to deal with the accelerating level of packaging which qualified for de minimis over your tenure. Why don't you tell us about that?
Sure, happy to be here, and thanks for the opportunity, Scott. I believe that in 2015 that the expectation was that raising the de minimis level would allow CBP and all those other government agencies that Marianne called out and Victoria called out to streamline their processing by reducing the document requirements and the duty collection responsibilities by shifting more transactions into a low risk bucket. But what actually resulted when the increase in the level combined with the explosion of e-commerce was actually less visibility into a large and growing number of shipments, because there was a lot less data about those shipments available to the government. And as most of you know, that data is actually used by government agencies to assess risk and decide whether those shipments need additional inspection or enforcement action. Right now, CBP is actually, the last time I checked, which was probably over a year ago, when I made the transition from CBP, CBP was seeing over 1 million shipments a day, which claim the de minimis exemption, the vast majority of which are valued at less than $800. And so that change from 200 to 800 may not have significantly impacted the characteristics of shipments claiming the de minimis exemption. So since 2016, when the level changed, the government's been working on a new oversight approach with a few key goals. Really, the first and most important is that imports remain safe and secure. They're also looking to support the businesses that are driving economic growth and the consumer choice that results from e-commerce. They're working very hard to harmonize both internationally as well as across the US government. And they're also trying to ensure the evolving supply chain parties are included, along with small businesses that may not have been really actively engaged in international trade in the past. So traditionally, as part of its risk management approach, CBP is generally focused on where the greatest shipment volume and value are. The agency has determined over time that a combination of screening of electronic data, along with using various inspection technologies with their expertise, combined with very targeted physical inspection, provides the best use of government resources, it keeps trade flowing, and it keeps the American public safe. And this has worked really well for traditional import and export patterns. But in the small package arena, what we've seen is that volume and value have diverged, which poses a conflict for the agency's risk management approach. And the proposed solutions, which are being tested now, generally include collecting additional, though limited, data to support efficient risk targeting on de minimis shipments. So there are a couple of ongoing challenges that I'd like to raise before I turn it over to Beth. The first really is that neither the government nor consumers right now have enough visibility into third-party shipments to make good decisions about risk. We don't know who's exporting those goods or where they're coming from in many cases. The second challenge is really making sure that we are getting the right data at the right time from the right party. At this point, there are so many new and evolving players in supply chains, and we need a really good understanding of who those parties are, what they do, and what information they should provide. And then finally, we need to harmonize that data collection and the operational approach at the border across agencies and ideally across countries. Not to touch on a third rail, but this needs to apply across the board, which has to include the postal environment. This will require all of us to work together to create a legal framework which is not only good for today, but is future-proofed so that it evolves to where we are 10 years from now. And we need to ensure that everyone understands what they have to do to be compliant and support safe and secure supply chains. My 2 cents.
Thank you, Brenda. Beth, things look different when you're buying large volumes versus small volumes. You're the compliance officer for a major apparel retailer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to WITA for having me. I am not a trade nerd. I actually started to play a government relations professional during a pandemic, and that has continued. So I say that because I bring a slightly myopic and bipolar view on this, right? So when we were talking, for those of you who don't know, American Eagle Outfitters, we're in over 900 locations in the US and Canada. We also have stores in Hong Kong and Mexico, and we ship to 81 countries, and we have an international presence. So we're certainly US based, Pittsburgh headquarters, but we do a lot of international work. So I will say it's bipolar because you wouldn't expect somebody from a business like me to be showing up on a panel in part advocating for or interested in more trade restriction. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's also bipolar within my own company. We are always looking at supply chain logistics, how to improve inventory management. And some of that may include using international direct-to-consumer fulfillment. And so, but the reason what brought me to this conversation, and I appreciate Ken for reaching out, our perspective, and we differ with some of our peer companies, admittedly, is that we think this is a fundamental fairness issue. So I started to say, so for those of you who don't know, if you either wear jeans or athleisure or buy jeans or athleisure for people who do, hopefully you've heard of American Eagle, so we're either American Eagle or Aerie. So we have 900 stores, but we also have 36% of our revenue for 2021 came from our e-commerce. So we see we see all of the issues, but on this one, it was fundamental fairness. It started first and foremost with the UFLPA. So the forced labor statute, we're very concerned about more direct consumer shipments coming that are not evaluated. We believe that the issue deserves the strict scrutiny it's getting, but how do you handle that issue now if more shipments are shifted to or exempted from scrutiny that we think is really important. And then the existing tariffs, and this gets to what you were saying about Brenda about being future-proof. So again, I say myopic because we're looking at our environment that we're operating in now. With the existing tariffs, I think we looked at it could have been something like 40% higher for the exemption. It creates an advantage. So we're looking at it from that perspective. If you follow American Eagle, we also are in the domestic logistics business. And so we did acquire a logistics company, and we have about 13 facilities now across the US. We acquired a last mile. So we're really interested in this. I realize it's not an easy solution. It's also not going to solve all of the problems. Brenda, I'm learning about a lot of the postal issue and everything else that goes along with this. But I really appreciated the opportunity to share this perspective that may surprise some people where American Eagle is coming from on this specific issue.
Thank you so much, Beth. And our final panelist is Ben. Ben, while he works for the National Foreign Trade Council now, which is a represents globally engaged companies. He's previously a counsel for CBP and knows the customs and border issues well. But Ben, if you could give us a flavor of what's going on and why people are exercised about the provisions in the conference that's going on now.
Absolutely. Good morning, Scott. Good morning to my fellow panelists and to everyone attending the webinar today. I'm honored to be part of this event. So thanks to Ken and WITA for having me here. As Marianne said, the de minimis exemption has been a part of customs law for nearly 100 years. It helps streamline customs clearance, lower logistics costs, and it lessens the administrative burden on U.S. customs officials who clear millions of shipments through our ports every day. Congress raised the U.S. De minimis threshold from $200 to $800 in just 2016 because businesses and consumers. There's a bill to the House Competes Act, known as the Import Security and Fairness Act, sponsored by Congressman Blumenauer, that would severely restrict the de minimis exemption. We strongly oppose this bill and are urging its removal from any final conference bill between the House and Senate for several reasons. First and foremost, inflation. The restriction on the use of de minimis would undoubtedly raise prices and limit consumer choice. The increased tariffs on products would be passed on directly to consumers and immediately worsen the inflation rate. Inflation falls hardest on low-income Americans who spend a greater share of their income on necessities than high-income Americans. And with inflation levels now at 8.3%, this is the wrong policy at the wrong time. Second, the supply chain. Over the course of the last 2+ years during the ongoing pandemic, we have all experienced the effects of major supply chain disruptions and bottlenecks. On top of delays due to port congestion, businesses have faced employee shortages, rising labor costs, and transportation-related shortages like containers and chassis. Changes in de minimis eligibility and data retention requirements would likely create massive confusion and a chaotic situation at our ports. So amid these supply chain disruptions, this bill would make shipping even more expensive, more complex, and more time-consuming. And third, de minimis disproportionately benefits small and medium-sized businesses, allows them to import low-value components for subsequent manufacturing in the US and goods for retail sale, which helps keep prices low by providing simplified processes at the border. Some have called de minimis a loophole. It is not. It's simply not true that the de minimis provision contributes to the unfettered entry of illicit goods into the United States. CBP has never stated that it's incapable of assessing the risk of low-value shipments and interdicting illicit products among them. The same manifest information, which CBP uses to target goods of all values, is also provided on every de minimis shipment, and each de minimis shipment receives the same risk assessment as every other shipment. Finally, I'll say that the proponents of the Blumenauer bill have said that de minimis shipments have exploded since the threshold was raised in 2016, but CBP's own data on de minimis shipments tells a different story. From fiscal year 2012 to 2021, the data shows that de minimis shipments were growing steadily before 2016, when the de minimis threshold was increased. And while the volume of de minimis shipments has increased since 2016, the total value of de minimis shipments is currently trending downward. In fact, the total value of de minimis shipments dropped 41% between 2020 and 2021. And the total value of de minimis shipments from China dropped 78% between 2020 and 2021. So in summary, I'd say with inflation at a 40-year high, supply chain disruptions ongoing, and the value of de minimis shipments actually trending downwards, restricting de minimis, it's the wrong policy at the wrong time. Over to you, Scott.
Well, thanks for that, Ben. That's a great summary of your organization's point of view. What I'd like to do is ask general questions of the panelists. If you have comments for each other, you're welcome to do that, or suggestions. But it seems to me that this period of time, there was a step change in de minimis in 2016, but in this 6-year period, almost everything in our lives has changed, affecting, whether it's the growth of small and micro sellers, whatever the format, whether it's package delivery to our homes. After 2 years of COVID, we all know our UPS and FedEx drivers by name, and so we certainly we always recognize the mailman, but we do have a sense of how important this is to our daily lives. But these are all areas which have changed pretty radically in the lives of Americans over that same time period. So, what is the current situation, and what remains unanswered that is not being considered by policymakers at this time? Just a general toss-up question.
Scott, if I could clarify just a bit and comment on my colleague's opening remarks, one of the things that our members really brought home to me is this mental jump we've all made, or a conflation between de minimis and e-commerce. They are not synonymous, okay? There is no way to tell whether a package is ordered online once it arrives at customs. And the question is, does it matter for risk purposes? Okay, that is the ultimate question for, I think, the government, how it regulates these type of shipments. But to go to your second round of questions, Scott, I was tracking this when I was CEO of, AEI. Since the financial crisis in 2008, traditional trade, which, the container ocean-going trade of the top 1,000 importers and exporters was flat. But e-commerce was growing 20% of the year. I saw the numbers. And that's why we brought it to the WCO, PSEG, and ultimately the e-commerce framework of standards to be negotiated. And while we saw the steady growth, I never envisioned something like a pandemic to make that shift permanent and accelerate those trends, because the e-commerce supply chain was the only thing that could withstand a pandemic, okay? And so that's why we are where we are. And, again, to go back to something that Ben said, it's not just duty-free entry, it's simplified processes. And it took me a long time to understand why e-commerce was so successful. And I've been kind of chastised as a trade nerd and somewhat of a heretic. It's because it turns everything on its trade on its head. You have buyers or looking for sellers' goods, right? And on a global basis. So flips that relationship. It also allows MSMEs to trade globally. And let's face it, complexity of the process is the trade barrier. And both consumers and e-sellers have voted with their feet. And it's when you order something online, it's a sale first and then an import or export afterwards. And the biggest challenge that we haven't grappled with is, how do we get information from that foreign seller, which is the weakest link in the supply chain? And that's the problem of having customs administrations deal with this issue, because they don't have jurisdiction over that foreign seller.
Fair enough.
Scott, if I could jump in for a second,
Sure.
I could not agree more with Marianne and Ben about the need for simplified processes. I think here in the US, customs and the government writ large is looking at how do we streamline our trade processes under the 21st Century Customs Framework Initiative. However, one of the things, and I love the phrase, Marianne, you said flip it on its head. That's exactly right. Because in the past, what the customs legal framework has really rested on is the US importer. And all of the legal requirements fall on the US importer. But in the e-commerce environment, that US importer are you and I, that are ordering things on the web and having a package show up on our doorstep within a couple of days, sometimes within a couple of hours. I have no idea. I do, but my mother has no idea what the requirements are around importing that particular shipment. And so at CBP, we used to have long discussions about, okay, who's responsible? Is it the broker? And I don't want to give Victoria a heart attack, because at the end of the day, probably not, though they certainly support compliance. Should it be the platform, or should it be that foreign seller? And I think there's really a lack of clarity around who is the appropriate party that not only can Customs and Border Protection and other government agencies be able to reach from an enforcement perspective, but who has the responsibility to follow the rules? And who does the consumer see as being responsible, so that they can make a good decision about the risk, whether it's an intellectual property rights risk, whether it's a value risk, that they can make a good assessment about what they're purchasing.
That's a very interesting way to put it, Brenda. And one of the things both Marianne and Brenda pointed out is that small and micro sellers are just trying to do business. And with a low de minimis, or without the simplification, ordinary business practices like handling a return become so complicated that it's almost not worth the customer. You're losing money on every single customer. So very interesting point. But the turning it on its head is new to me. So Victoria or Beth, any perspective on this? Or we go on to another issue?
Yeah, I would just like to say that as a customs broker, I am not against de minimis or Section 321 entries. I'm not against it. I order online. My husband is a big online orderer. He doesn't like to leave the house. But for me, as a customs broker, the process for that, of course, needs to be simplified. And we felt that with the entry type 86, allowing us to do that for our customers, to make sure that, we reviewed the product, we made sure they knew what they were bringing in, why they were bringing it in, and was it subject to any other government agency. And then we could simply just go in and through a simplified process and limited data, we could present that information electronically. And we feel that that's worked for the brokerage community. I can't speak for self-filers, but for the brokerage community, I can say that that's really worked for us. And it simplifies the process. Now, in recent discussions with Customs, it's very clear that they are looking to receive data from other parties. And we feel that they need to be very specific when they determine who those parties are and explaining what they are. Because right now, a consignee in Customs eyes, or at least so we've been told, is a carrier. So, and though manifest is used right now, there's no tariff number, there's just a description and the shipper and the consignee. So if the consignee is the carrier, they are allowed to file the Section 321 via the manifest. And if that description is limited, how does the system know, or Customs know, that that description bag, is that a handbag? Is that a plastic bag? Is that a colostomy bag? Is that an airbag for a vehicle? Just don't know. Now, they say that they have AI technology that can figure it out. I haven't been privy to that AI technology, but I find it very difficult without a buyer and a seller to know exactly where that's coming from, and to make sure that it's safe and secure when it comes in, and that the person purchasing it knows that it is. I mean, we have a lot of clients that are buying used auto parts that are coming from overseas. How do they know that that specific auto part when they put it on their car, is going to keep their vehicle safe and secure. You know, brake pads, those kinds of things are, of course, with the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. So again, just little things like that, which seem little, but can escalate, you know, because there's billions of people in the world that are buying these things. And I'm not just talking about in the US, I'm talking overseas as well, that can find themselves in danger. So just want to let you know, we love 321. We like the entry type 86 because it helps us simplify the process, because not all of us have access to manifest. But there are some concerns about the parties involved.
Fair point. As a former owner of a geriatric European car, I was part of that flow of auto parts from Europe to the United States, one piece at a time. So but these things happen. So Beth, I wanted to follow up on a comment you made. You were very polite when you talked about level playing fields and fairness, the fundamental fairness. And one of the things I've observed is, look, apparel still has fairly high MFN tariffs, 9-10% range. And a de minimis shipment of apparel pays zero tariff. American Eagle Outfitters pays the full freight. Am I onto something, or, I mean, what do we do?
Yeah, so, and I think there was a question about, well, if the tariffs go away, does your concern go away? Again, we have a concern about the forced labor analysis and how that's going to happen. I mean, that is such a fundamental issue for our industry, that's where we're also motivated by it. So I've been asked, if the tariffs go away, does American Eagle change its position? And for us, no, because that is such an overriding concern. And I would also just add, somebody had mentioned, these small businesses are just trying to do business, but that's our position. We're all just trying to do business, and it would be great if we could have the right knowledge. And until that happens, we just think this, is a problem. And from a fundamental fairness, level playing field, everybody's dealing with the same level of information. It is kind of where we're coming from now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. And Ben, before Ken comes back with questions from the audience, you're opposed to Mr. Blumenauer's bill. What I learned in my years on the Hill is it's very hard to fight something with nothing. And so if we're not going to do what Congressman Blumenauer would like to do, what would you recommend? Either Congress or the administration writ large?
Sure, Scott. First, I'll touch on some of these programs that are currently underway that should not be short-circuited, some of which were initiated under former EAC Smith's tenure at the Office of Trade. Victoria just talked about it, the 321 data pilot. Companies who are participating in the 321 data pilot are voluntarily providing advanced data to CBP, such as a product description, URL, or product image that can be even more descriptive than an HTS number. CBP has stated that the pilot has been very effective in helping CBP target illicit goods. Victoria also mentioned the entry type 86 test, which I think has the greatest number of de minimis shipments now through all modes of entry. And also, an ongoing partnership with private industry and CBP to modernize trade through the 21st century customs framework. These are all deliberative, important partnerships that can help us understand how to collect the right data from the right party at the right time. So that would be my answer to what we should do now. But I did want to touch on your earlier question about the pandemic. We have all been affected by some of these severe shortages. At the outset, it was toilet paper, and then semiconductors, and that affected automobiles and batteries as well. Recently, infant formula. My wife is pregnant, and we are expecting a baby, and I fully expect to be fighting that battle soon. And I think what has been shown is that in order to address these supply chain disruptions and shortages, trade facilitation is more important than ever. The Biden administration is trying to increase the resiliency of supply chains. And so it's really important that we have as many different sources as we can for various products. And USTR is currently negotiating for a higher de minimis threshold in other countries around the world and for a removal of various loopholes to their de minimis regime. If we restrict de minimis in the way that the Blumenauer bill intends to, it would severely undercut those efforts that USTR is making abroad to increase market access for American companies.
We're going to turn to audience questions in about 3 minutes. But before we do, I want to offer our panelists who have been incredibly patient and reserved so far, if they have questions for each other, this would be a great time to pose it, or other things where you haven't been heard and you'd like to make a comment.
So I'll take the bait on this one. Number one, just as a comment, I think what has muddied the waters is our trade policy with China that has kind of seeped through the back door. Congress has to make a fundamental decision whether we want to trade with China or not. So that goes to the forced labor issue and some of these other issues. And de minimis has gotten swept up in that. And to allude to Ben's point, that's the problem with, Chairman Blumenauer's bill is it identifies one country that we're going to block those de minimis shipments. Well, it really wasn't designed for that, like a trade program, again. But to be provocative with my colleagues, this also gets swept up into what we're talking about with 21st Century Customs Framework and Senator Cassidy's bill, which is called the Customs Modernization Act of 2021. Where we're having a problem is, what is customs modernization? We need to come to some understanding between the trade community and customs of what this new customs regime should look like. Because as Brenda alluded to, and I fully agree, the regime centered around an importer of record physically located in the jurisdiction of the Customs Administration with legal jurisdiction over them, that's collapsing. Okay. Now, when we went through this with supply chain security and we had 10+2, we leveraged those large multinational companies as importers of record to get that data earlier because they had an overwhelming financial interest to get their goods into the country. We don't have that leverage anymore. So we need a new concept of what constitutes account-based management and risk management spectrum to deal with, or that is calibrated to the type of different entities that are now part of the trade community. And I think that's why we're having such a struggle with this particular issue, because it's almost like a Rorschach test. Everybody sees something different when we talk about de minimis. And that's why we're getting legislation, even from outside of House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committee, because of e-commerce. And then it's getting dumped into a discussion of de minimis, which is at the technical level. And we really need to go back to the conceptual level.
Thank you for that, Marianne. I won't cut anybody off. Yes, go ahead, Beth.
Marianne, I really appreciate that. Again, I'm so excited to be a part of this group, and I acknowledge from the beginning I have very myopic views, right? So you have people like me and my company and my colleagues hearing about this issue saying, what are we going to do? We have to do something about it. And where does it fit into the much larger discussion? And so you have people like me kind of entering discussions, talking with our legislators, playing the government relations folks. So these conversations are really helpful, but I'm so thrilled that I was able to be here because this is a very real issue for us. I understand there's policy implications and future proofing and all of that, but for us, what I said earlier, we're just trying to do business as well now, and we have to navigate that. So this is, for me, the very clear intersection of where policy and kind of practical really are mixing, and it is the de minimis e-commerce issue, especially in the apparel industry where the cotton issue is huge. The tariffs are a big issue as well. So this was really helpful for me, so I appreciate it.
Beth, I think you raised some really excellent points, and what I was going to follow on to Mary Ann's comments about is we can set out all the provisions that we want, but if the U.S. government, particularly CBP in this case, can't enforce them effectively, then they're not worth the paper they're written on. And I will tell you, whether it's enforcement of intellectual property rights, anti-dumping and countervailing duty rules, or any customs environment, that if customs can't effectively enforce, either by reaching to the particular party involved, by pursuing something efficiently through the courts, there is no way that our regime is going to be effective. So as we're thinking about new legislation, we've got to make sure that it is enforceable, and that the specific agency being asked to enforce the new rules has the resources to be able to do it.
Thank you, both Beth and Brenda. Excellent comments. Ken, what does the audience want to hear about?
So got a very smart audience, let's just say, with some really sharp questions coming in. They seem to have differentiated. There's sort of the tariff issue itself and the cost issue, and then there's the safety issue. And there's questions about, the cotton from Shenzhen, and some of the issues that were raised about that Victoria was raising about the safety of goods. If we got rid of all tariffs, if that tariff-free world that the free traders have been seeking for the last 70 plus years or even more were to exist, what kind of data would still be needed to be able to have the safety of these shipments that is separate and apart from the tariff question, which we've talked about fairly well? What is, and then it's one of the people raised that that the private carriers provide data. There's data that's provided to CBP, but private posts don't have to do that. So what is needed to address this problem?
Maybe I could take a run at this, or at least a starting run. So I think there's really two groups of information that would be useful. The first is really good insights into the parties to the transaction, whether it's the manufacturer, the shipper, the US importer, the ultimate purchaser that actually is responsible for the movement of those goods into the United States. And so those parties to the transaction give the government a good sense of whether they're dealing with a known party and a party that has been compliant in the past, or whether that particular entity has presented a risk in the past. So that helps in the risk assessment. And then the second thing is a really good understanding of what those goods actually are. You'll notice I did not say the HTS number at any level, 6-digit or 10-digit. But for now, that is the HTS number, Harmonized Tariff System number, is what CBP's targeting systems are built on. They are making tremendous strides in applying artificial intelligence to commercial transactions, looking for anomalies, helping in the assessment. But at this point, because the initial input, that cargo description, often is pretty lousy, using artificial intelligence to essentially triangulate on what the actual tariff number is likely to be still means that for most transactions, to do a really good job of risk assessment, CBP and the other government agencies that often use the HTS number, they still need that number. Now, no comment, Victoria, on whether that is in fact then the dividing line between what is customs business and thereby must be done by a customs broker and what isn't. But a tariff number is pretty important, or a very good replacement.
Anyone want to jump in on that? Mary Ann.
The only comment I would make is one of the reasons I started EMTC with fellow trade nerds is because either at the WCO, at customs and various fora where we're having these discussions, nobody really represents small businesses, you know? And I also realize in the e-commerce context, we're not going to make them into trade nerds. What is different about the e-commerce industry, not specifically about de minimis, is they have economies of scale and large computing power. And I think the solution is this to these issues in terms of identity and data will be artificial intelligence, blockchain, and a combination of technologies. And that's why we're doing a white paper on legal acceptability, customs acceptability of decisions made by AI and the legal status of that. But at the end of the day, we still have to go to risk management. Whenever the government asks for data, my hero, Bob Anger, who was a trade nerd par excellence at CBDP and then at Booz Allen, he taught me whenever the government asks you for data, you ask data for what? And every data element has to go to some risk indicia. And that's what we really want to sit down with CBP and say, you know, does form of payment, is that a risk data element in the e-commerce context, as opposed to paying with a credit card? You know, I don't know. And at the end of the day, when the package shows up, what is the risk associated with that package? And how can you tell whether it's an online shipment or de minimis shipment or other? Okay, so that's what we have to grapple with in terms of where we are in this really sea change of the environment.
Thank you. Yeah, we have several questions I'm going to try to lump together if I can, that conceptually get to a few things. So one of them has to do, and Ben, I'm going to direct this a little towards you, but others can jump in as well. I think Beth, this has implications for you as well, as sort of how do you balance the interests and abilities of small and medium enterprises? Some of, Ben, you have the Global Innovation Forum as part of the NFTC's universe, a lot of small businesses there. You also have large businesses that have different interests with de minimis. And I know, Beth, you're a large company, but you're also competing with specialty retailers who are smaller. How do you, in all of this, how do we juggle the different abilities and capabilities of a very large shipper, you know, whether or e-platform company like an Amazon or a Walmart, with some of these much smaller companies, as well as the big retailers and the smaller specialty sellers? Ben?
You know, I'll just reiterate that the de minimis provision allows these micro, small, medium-sized businesses oftentimes to be able to export and to sell abroad, because they don't need to fill out, you know, cumbersome forms or employ the services of a customs broker, which can be prohibitive for them. And I think it's very dangerous to get into an arms race with protectionist measures like, you know, lowering de minimis thresholds or making de minimis regimes very complicated, which limits foreign trade. And so there are a lot of businesses that both import and export, and therefore they would benefit from a very open de minimis regime at home and abroad.
So thank you for tabling that, because it pivots to something, follows back on something you raised earlier, Ben, but also 2 or 3 of the questions have come in asking about the regimes in other countries, that they seem to be, the US is asking for certain things in its trade discussions with other countries. The EU structure apparently is evolving and changing, in the UK as well. One of the questions even said they're going in the opposite direction. I don't know what is opposite from this multifaceted discussion we're having, which is not just one-sided and not just the upside down, but the right side up. I don't know which way to look at that, but can we talk a little bit about what other countries are doing, and is there any hope at all of some uniform standards? If we're able to do it, one would think, on global tax and reach some understandings, is there any efforts underway to harmonize in some ways some of these customs procedures and information and data sharing and things that are covered by de minimis?
I love that idea of standardizing it. and I hope that the brighter minds in the audience will take that idea and run with it. With respect to the Blumenauer bill specifically, there is this misconception out there that China's de minimis threshold is only $7, much, much lower than $800. China's de minimis level is actually around $786, almost identical to the US de minimis level. And this de minimis level applies to 1,500 products contained on a published list that are popular with consumers. So this misconception comes from an interpretation of Chinese law that if the calculated duties for a single shipment are below renminbi 50, or about $7.86, then the shipment is exempt from customs duties. Now, this measure applies to goods that are not on this list of 1,500 e-commerce products, which are duty-free if their value is under renminbi 5,000. So this is different from the de minimis level, which relates to the value of the merchandise. Yes, the de minimis regimes in other places like Europe are a little bit more complicated because of the VAT tax. All of these sort of complications make it difficult for a small business owner who wants to export abroad to really get started. And so I love that idea of kind of creating a standards around this issue.
If nothing else, at WITA, we're all for encouraging large global trade negotiations to take place that take many years. It's full employment for WITA members.
As I recall, Canada had a ridiculously low de minimis, right? Something like $20 Canadian.
And we got that raised in USMCA.
Yes.
I mean, a couple associations really championed it and made it happen, which was the first big reversal that I remember, because the Canadian retailers were so powerful that when I would raise this with Canadian officials, they just laughed at me.
Right.
So, but VAT does drive a lot of this issue. And the United States is the largest economy that doesn't have a VAT. Not that I'm encouraging that, but, and we haven't talked about the elephant in the room, which is the WTO negotiations on e-commerce that have been slow. And that, I think, is where the US really has to assert leadership in getting some accommodation, particularly on the standards of data or simplified processes, to the degree that you need them beyond the TFA and the revised Kyoto Convention, of what are the obligations of those foreign sellers, the exporters. And if the US led in what we are willing to ask of our US exporters, even though we want to promote exports, and e-commerce is an export platform. The problem for the United States is our de minimis is fairly high compared to other countries.
So thank you, Marianne. Feel like I'm understanding this a bit and also still having some trouble with this. Eric O'Toole, who many of you probably know, used to run the National Foreign Trade Zones group, asks an interesting question that, there's been some recommendations that Section 321 be expanded to allow de minimis entries from US foreign trade zones. Are there any merits to this proposal? Could it help ensure some of the fairness that we've been looking for and help reduce risk of illicit trade entering the US market if foreign trade zones were allowed to be part of the process? Anyone?
I'll bite.
Thank you, Brenda, and then Ben. Thank you.
So CBP, they don't make the law, they just enforce it. So the read of the law now is if we want to allow that, you need a change in the legal framework. However, we have seen over time that because of the prohibition on using foreign trade zones to process de minimis shipments, that a lot of the distribution centers and warehouses are built elsewhere, whether that's in China or whether that's over the border in Canada and Mexico. And clearly there's a case to be made for employment here in the US to allow foreign trade zones to play in that de minimis pool. I'll repeat something I said a couple of minutes ago, though. If we do that, the folks that enforce the foreign trade zone regulations are CBP. So you've got to make sure that they have the resources to do it right.
Ben?
I would just add that this is a great example of, I don't want to say unintended consequences, but the foreign trade zone statute, I think was part of, I don't know if it was part of the Tariff Act in 1930, but it was started around that time, certainly within the Roosevelt administration, to encourage more trade because global trade had collapsed during the Great Depression, and to encourage that employment, that trade-related employment through the foreign trade zones, which are technically outside the customs territory of the United States. So then when you get in a new environment where people are voting with their feet, trade and transportation are like water. They're going to find the most efficient route. So then when customs came out with that ruling, which was very well drafted, I have to say, from a technical point of view, but it had the knock-on effect of then moving the logistics outside the United States, which kind of, defeated the purpose of the FTZs to begin with. So, I do have sympathy for the situation that the FTZs find themselves in.
Ben?
The only thing I'll add is no, we're not opposed to de minimis being used from foreign trade zones, and just echo the comments of Brenda and Marianne.
Well, Victoria?
Yes, and I'll say the same thing as the Vice President of the National Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders Association. We too feel that was detrimental to logistics in the United States, and we would agree with, FTZs being allowed to function the same as the warehouses that are overseas and in Canada and Mexico.
Beth?
And I'll just chime in. It's certainly something we've talked about, but from my perspective, until there's a proposal, this is what we have now, and this is the issue we're facing. So yes, it would be a great discussion to have. But as I've understood, as Brenda pointed out, there's a lot that goes into that discussion, but it's certainly one we'd like to have.
Scott? Sorry, Victoria.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, and as we always tell ourselves in the brokerage industry, be careful what you ask for.
Don't, we're right, almost close to a consensus. We almost got agreement across the whole panel. Close, not quite. I'm not going to say it was unanimity, but we were close to having something where folks can see the diamond and the different facets a little bit. And possibly there's one thing in this world that maybe we can, if all the policymakers, Hill's listening, open to this discussion. Scott, thank you very much for moderating this really complicated topic. Ben, Beth, Brenda, the 3Bs, Victoria, Marianne, thank you so much for joining us today. Really grateful to all of you for joining us. Everyone, there were a lot of questions that ended up coming through. We will share those with the panelists so they can see your comments if they weren't able to see them while they were paying attention and taking part in the discussion. So we'll share that with them as well. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our guests. We hope to have you all back again. Thank you to everyone who gave us input on this event. We appreciated that. It helped us craft what we hope is a balanced discussion here today. Everyone take care. We hope to see you if you're in DC with Ambassador Catherine Tai on Monday morning. If you're in Los Angeles, to join us for our event at the Summit of the Americas. I'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.